Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the tragic case of George Greenwell and the alleged murder of George McDonald, which took place in Whitley Bay in 1908. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information about the past life of George Greenwell. Said to be around 51 years old at the time the crime was committed, George would have been born in around 1857. His place of birth and parents are unknown. George mainly worked as a chimney sweep, but it was said he also had a small shop, although it is later said that he did not really have any regular work. He was a married man with 5 children and lived in the Hillheads area of Whitley Bay. George had been arrested for assault once before in 1885. George McDonald, the victim, was born in Scotland in around 1854 to parents John and Mary, and was one of at least 7 children. He had married Isabella in around 1880, and the couple had at least 7 children together. They had at first moved to Byker from Scotland and then to Walker before moving to the Hillheads area of Whitley Bay, where George, who had begun his working life as a farmer, had found work as a miner at East Holywell Colliery. Now, I have searched this colliery and I have been led towards the remains of the colliery that you can see on screen at the moment, so I do hope that this is the correct one. Neither men were known to be great drinkers, although like most at the time they did enjoy a drink when not working. And it was known that the families had been involved in a feud for some years, although it's not made entirely clear what started the feud between them. Due to the fact that both men have the same Christian name, for a lot of this story I will refer to them by their surnames to avoid any confusion. On June the 20th, 1908, in the late afternoon, John Leishman and George McDonald were in Whitley Bay drinking in the Railway Inn at Hillheads. On their walk to this pub, George had complained to John about George Greenwell, saying he had recently let his pigs out of their sty on purpose. On entering the pub, they found George Greenwell was already inside, standing near the bar. MacDonald did not speak to him, just simply going to the bar to order his drink. The men at first stood quietly drinking, but then Greenwell and MacDonald began an argument about the pigs. MacDonald finished his drink and left the pub. Greenwell followed him out and both men appeared to be heading home. As MacDonald passed Greenwell's door, he suddenly turned back and punched Greenwell in the stomach. Greenwell quickly struck back, hitting MacDonald on the jaw, and the man fell to the ground. P.C. Angus, who had been inside the pub at the time, heard of the fight, and on arriving outside, he found MacDonald unconscious on the ground. He tried to awaken him, but was not able to do so, and he helped to carry him back to his home, and a doctor was sent for. George McDonald died 4 days later without ever regaining consciousness, and P.C. Angus then arrested George Greenwell on a charge of causing the death of George McDonald. The inquest was held at the police courts in Whitley Bay before Coroner Rutherford. Isabella MacDonald said she had identified the body as being that of her husband George, who was 56 years old. She said the police had carried him home on Saturday, June the 20th, and he had died on the 24th. She said there'd been many disagreements with the Greenwells, and someone had recently let their pigs out, but she did not know who, although George Greenwell seemed to believe it had been her husband. Greenwell interrupted, asking Isabella, "Didn't your husband insult me and my wife every time he passed my door?" She replied, saying, "I could not say." He then asked her, "Didn't he threaten me?" To which she replied, "I did not hear him do that." He did not ask anything further. John Leishman said he had been out drinking with Greenwell on Saturday, June the 20th. He said they had first gone out at around 1:15 p.m. He said Greenwell had had quite a few drinks, but he did not feel that he was drunk. He said they had discussed MacDonald on the way to the railway inn. He said Greenwell was certain that he had let his pigs out of their sty and that he had done so on purpose. He was not very happy about this, but it seems he did not say if he wished revenge. On entering the pub, John said MacDonald was at the bar, and at first they both ignored him. P.C. Angus entered the bar and Greenwell spoke to him, and it was after this that Greenwell and MacDonald began to argue about the pigs. Although John did not go into great detail, it seems the argument did not last very long and they were asked to leave the pub. He said that MacDonald finished his drink and left first, he assumed to head home. Greenwell, he said, left just after him. And when Greenwell arrived at his door, MacDonald had just passed it, and it was then that he turned and struck Greenwell a punch in the stomach. Greenwell struck him back, hitting MacDonald square on the jaw, and the man fell to the ground, hitting his head on the pavement. James Clark from Whitley Bay said he heard the two men arguing inside the pub and later saw the fight outside. He said he saw MacDonald strike the first blow and Greenwell strike MacDonald on the chin in return, and MacDonald fell to the ground. At this point, George Greenwell spoke to say that MacDonald had also sneered at him about the pigs and scandalised his wife, although he did not exactly say what MacDonald had said. John Dowson, landlord of the Railway Inn, said the men had been in his pub on June the 20th. They had been quiet at first, but then began arguing, and he had ordered them out. He said MacDonald left first and Greenwell followed. He said both men had been drinking, but he did not believe either of them were drunk, and he did not know what the argument was about. P.C. Angus said he had been in the Railway Inn at the same time as the two men on the day of the fight. He said he did not hear them argue, but after they had left he was told of a fight outside, and he went to see what was happening. By the time he got outside, MacDonald was already lying on the ground unconscious. He tried to bring him round but was not able to do so, so he helped to carry him to his home, and a doctor was sent for. He also said that both men had clearly been drinking, but he did not feel that either of them had actually been drunk. He ended by saying that when he had been informed a few days later that MacDonald had died, he had immediately gone to the home of Greenwell and arrested him on the charge of causing the death of George McDonald. He said the only statement that Greenwell made was to say, "He struck me first, I only put out my hand to defend myself." Dr. Blandy said he had been called to the home of George MacDonald on June the 20th, and he had taken care of him from then until his death. He said he had never regained consciousness and had remained in bed the entire time. Greenwell then asked the doctor if he had been aware that MacDonald had fallen from his bed on the night of the 20th after he had left, and hit his head. Dr. Blandy said he was not aware of this. Dr. Blandy then continued to say that he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of George MacDonald. He said he had found 2 small bruises externally on the man's head, but these only appeared to be minor. Internally he found a large blood clot on the brain at the back of the head. He said this had been the cause of death, and would have resulted from the strike from Greenwell and the subsequent fall to the ground hitting the back of his head. One of the jurymen then asked the doctor if it was possible that a fall from bed could have caused the same injuries, and the doctor said it was possible, but he did not think that MacDonald had fallen from his bed, as he had not been conscious, so unable to move or get up at all. Isabella MacDonald was then recalled and asked if her husband had fallen out of bed on the night of the fight, and she replied that he had not. Greenwell was then asked if there was anything more he would like to say, and he said that he had a witness to the fact that MacDonald had threatened him with a knife just the week before. This was dismissed as not being relevant to the case. The coroner then spoke to the jury, saying it was for them to decide if there was enough evidence to justify a verdict of manslaughter. If one man had committed a crime that resulted in the death of another, then it was manslaughter. The jury retired for only a short time before returning a verdict of manslaughter against George Greenwell, and he was committed for trial. It was then asked if he could be considered for legal assistance under the Poor Prisoners Act to fund a defence. It was stated that he had no regular work and 5 children to support. Superintendent Tuff said he had no issue with the application for support being made, and Greenwell was then allowed out on bail until the trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for George MacDonald. However, I am aware that he was buried in St Paul's Churchyard in Whitley Bay. There does not appear to have been any information about the burial in the local papers at the time, so it is possible that the family wished to keep it private, and I did not find any evidence of a headstone for George in the churchyard. The trial began in early July of 1908 in Newcastle before Mr. Justice Grantham. George pleaded not guilty to the charge. The full details of the case were read over to the judge and jury at what would have been the start of the trial. This was perfectly normal and always happened at most trials. However, I don't normally mention this part in the stories. While this was happening, the first witness, John Leishman, waited to be questioned. But before this could happen, the judge asked him, "Did the prisoner do anything more than you would have done had you been struck in the stomach?" And he replied with a simple no. The prosecution said they would like to call for further evidence. However, the judge spoke, saying, "Is this really needed? There is no doubt that the prisoner struck back." The prosecution agreed at this point that further evidence on this matter was not needed. The judge then stated, "I do not think this is a case for a full hearing before the jury. The prisoner was attacked by the deceased and seems to have done little more than to raise his hand to return the blow." The jury were then asked to give their verdict on the case and replied with a decision of not guilty. George Greenwell was then discharged and was free to go. I did not find any further details for George Greenwell and his family after this date. This was a very sad case. It seems that a petty argument between neighbours got out of hand and resulted in a fight where one man lost his life, leaving a widow and several children. Who was to blame for his death? Well, it would seem that had MacDonald not attacked Greenwell, he would not have attacked back, resulting in the fall to the ground, which was ultimately the cause of death. So in some respects, MacDonald was sadly, it seems, the cause of his own demise. However, I also do feel that Greenwell was in some way responsible for MacDonald's death, as it was his punch that caused him to fall, and by today's standards he would have been more likely to have been found guilty of manslaughter. I do feel that he was lucky to find a judge who felt this was an accident and did not allow it to go to trial, where a jury may have come to a different conclusion after hearing all of the evidence. I do find it hard to decide if this was the right decision. Greenwell no doubt lashed out without thinking, but his actions did still cause the death of MacDonald. But did he deserve to go to prison for this? Well, in this case, I do have to admit that I am not entirely sure. But what do you think? Do you think the judge was wrong to stop the trial and allow Greenwell to be discharged? Or do you think the trial should have been continued and the jury allowed to come to their own conclusion from all of the evidence? Do you think Greenwell was ultimately responsible for the death of MacDonald? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.